Welcome to the Humans First, Technology Second, a holistic approach to digital transformation here at the Forward Festival. My name is Sarah Kramer, and I'm the principal of Blueprint for Engineering, a firm that focuses on digital transformation. I've been an advisor, an author, and an evaluator for 17 years, and I'm really passionate about designing for humans in technology, as well as in the manufacturing and engineering fields. So today's session is going to focus on holistic digital transformation. And first, we're going to start with Industry 4.0 so that we all have a broad understanding of where we've been and where we're heading in this new era. Then we're going to understand why it's important to approach digital transformation from a holistic viewpoint. Then we're going to focus on learning a human systems framework to design and implement a digital change. And then lastly, we're going to understand 5 ways to integrate holistic digital systems design into your work. So, the Industrial Revolutions, and just a brief landscape on time to understand where we've been and what a unique time that we find ourselves in. So we are experiencing a profound shift in the way that we live and work, the way that businesses and governments are run. So from that perspective, it's very apt to consider what we are currently experiencing as a new revolution that's somewhat radical and sometimes abrupt in its change. So the 4th Industrial Revolution is just beginning. And as I've said, let's find out where we've been to understand how we're arriving at this moment in time. So we've experienced several revolutions previous to this one, and it began with the Agrarian Revolution. This was 10,000 years ago. It was a transition where humans went from foraging to farming. It included the domestication of animals, and it made producing, transportation, and communication possible at scale. And that took, like I said, 10,000 years. The first industrial revolution was around 1760 to 1840, and it was triggered by the construction of railroads and the invention of the steam engine. And this was the era of mechanical production. So notice how time is compressing. The second industrial revolution started in the late 19th century and it progressed into the early 20th. It featured electricity, the assembly line, and made mass production possible. The third industrial revolution is the one that we've been experiencing. So it occurred around the 1960s into the beginning of the 21st century. We've become very familiar and adept at computers and digital technologies. This was the era of the mainframe, the internet, and personal computers. It was really catalyzed by those things, including semiconductors and mainframe computing. So what I really want to bring forward before we leap into the 4th revolution is how time is accelerating. We're moving from 10,000 years of development to around 40 years in the 3rd revolution. And the technology is incredibly powerful. Its impact accelerates, so our need to understand what's happening and be able to navigate it well is of the most importance. So at the same time, I just want to mention, we live in the United States, but the industrial revolutions are unfolding at different times throughout the planet. So there's about 100 billion people or 1 billion people who don't have electricity and are more in the 2nd industrial revolution. And around 4 billion people don't even have internet access. So we need to bring the context of where we are in the United States to that more global perspective. So what does this mean for what's happening in this beginning time of Industry 4.0 and the dawn of a new industrial revolution. There are many definitions to what is happening right now, but many believe, many researchers, many thought leaders, many technologists believe that we are now in it. And yes, it is still having a lot to do with computers, hardware, and networks. It will remain part of this paradigm, but the level of sophistication and integration is dramatically increasing and becoming more ubiquitous. In this realm, we see that virtual and physical systems of manufacturing are more cooperative. We see this with robotics in manufacturing. And the main drivers are the connectivity of the Internet of Things, of robotics, of machine learning, and we have all been hearing and perhaps even experiencing artificial intelligence or AI as it becomes more and more common. In the United States, you may hear smart manufacturing as it relates to this paradigm, but you may also hear Industry 4.0, which is more coming out of Germany and Europe. And I will use both of those terms interchangeably throughout this session. So there's opportunities and challenges, and I'm just going to name some. There's definitely more in both of these categories. So on the opportunity side, and this is speaking more to the production aspect of Industry 4.0, is that it dramatically lowers consumer costs while raising productivity. It does provide greater accessibility to technology and platforms and connectivity somewhat, as we'll see in the challenges. So it does create more accessibility in a lot of ways, but those who very much benefit from this are those with capital. So innovators, investors, and shareholders seem to be garnering more of the reward as we move into this paradigm. So we need to really be mindful of what this means for this widening wealth gap between labor and those who own capital. And this is one of the impetuses for me bringing this information forward for all of you to start considering in your work, because we all will have to engage to understand how to navigate this well. On the challenges side, there's a big emphasis on technology and the innovation in technology and the research in technology. And there's a real lack of research and practice and standards of practice around the impacts on humans. This meaning the workers, the people who are using technology, and the general public. We are starting to see impacts on workforce turnover, which I'll bring forward in one of the case studies. We don't yet have robust training and education around how to use these technologies in the workplace, in the public. We're figuring that out. And again, there's health and safety concerns around confidentiality, privacy in the manufacturing environment. This can also come forward on the operational lines if there isn't proper training in place to protect the workers, which we'll unpack a bit more. And of course, there are even more challenges, but at a high level, these are some of the reasons I'm bringing forward this framework for all of you to consider. So the central question that I would love for you to start to consider as you listen to what I'm going to be bringing forward is, how should companies approach this change to Industry 4.0, given where we've been, given where we're heading, given the opportunities, and given the challenges. So the topic of this talk is digital transformation. And how does digital transformation fit in this landscape of change into Industry 4.0? So my definition of digital transformation is the process of designing, implementing, and operating Industry 4.0 technologies and capabilities within the infrastructure and management of a company, firm, or organization. But what does holistic digital transformation look like? So it includes the definition of digital transformation, but we're really bringing forward the process and approach of designing the Industry 4.0 system where human well-being and performance are at the center of our design and our thinking. But we're also considering how technology, organizational, and business components influence outcomes, influence human outcomes, influence business outcomes, influence organizational outcomes. So we're really trying to understand all of it without ignoring the impact that it is having on humans and bringing it more into our design and focus. So take a moment and explore your own thinking around what I've just brought forward around where Industry 4.0 is, the technologies in play, and how it might relate to your business or professional practice. And maybe it is already starting to play a role. So just try to think of one area where you might see a new technology, the Internet of Things, perhaps AI, perhaps machine learning, play a role in your personal, professional, or work organizations. And just jot your answer down. We'll come back to it. So before we dive into the framework to analyze and think about holistic digital transformation, let's dig a bit more into the why. So why should we care about bringing human-centered design into our thinking? So how is Industry 4.0 structured? There are at least 4 structural components to Industry 4.0. And it's important to note that 3 of the 4 structural components are related to human and organizational factors. So these aren't technology factors yet. These are factors that include resources, which includes human resources, organizational structure, and organizational culture, all highly influence the foundation for smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0. Technology is only one component of the overall structure that underlines this transformation. Others have also emphasized that human and organizational factors play an important role in the digitization of the manufacturing process. So sometimes, a lot of times, organizational and cultural factors are more difficult to address than the technical ones. And it's also really important to remember that when you're making an investment in digitizing some aspect of your personal process, your professional organization, that you invest with the technology, but also make organizational adjustments. So how does a practitioner go about thinking about diagnosing, describing human and organizational issues in their current process, or maybe you're just starting to think about it? So human factors engineering, which is my background, is really an apt field to help us understand this question. So this framework is the Industry 4.0 holistic system. And one of the reasons frameworks are so powerful in complex environments such as this, that it gives us a map. It gives us a way to organize our thinking, organize our planning, to see patterns in what's happening, and to be able to anticipate the challenges and problems that will inevitably arise as we navigate this space. So first I'm going to lay out this framework and show you how the pieces fit together. And then I'm going to go through 2 case studies that's going to help you understand how these factors play out in an Industry 4.0 environment. So as you can guess, at the center of the system is the people. So we start with the people. This includes people's motivations, it includes their stress levels, it includes the level of knowledge, skills, and behaviors that they have, their competencies. They are working within an environment called the organization. It can be a company, it could be a learning organization, it could be the government, but this includes things like culture, leadership style, whether or not the organization has a change management process. How do they approach communication? So the person is living and working within an organization that has a certain number of characteristics within an environment. So people work in a physical, and now we also work in virtual environments. So this can be a shop floor, but it can also be a Zoom call meeting the way we are all on one today. People engage in tasks and they have workload within a company. Most notably in a smart manufacturing or industry 4.0 environment, we look at how jobs are getting redesigned. So roles are shifting, duties are shifting, the way they interact with technology is shifting. It can be moving from responding to an alarm to anticipating alarm, as is the case with predictive analytics. And then the fifth component is the technology. So digital transformation tends to focus mostly on the technology, but in this model, it is only one of 5 elements that we're considering, and we put people in the center of that paradigm. So one other thing to note as you start to think about these buckets of a holistic digital transformation is that they are all interacting with one another. They're in relationship with one another. So we also want to understand how these different components impact the people within that system. If systems surrounding the people are not supportive, they will experience physiological stress, they'll experience burnout and lower levels of productivity. And we can imagine if the system supports them, the opposite is true. They don't have stress, they feel supported, they have levels of well-being, and their productivity is enhanced. So let's start to put this together into an environment. So it's a work environment. There is these 5 components always interacting with one another over time. We start to think about and engage in work processes. So in Industry 4.0, some holistic work processes include communication. How do you make decisions in a collaborative way? How do you understand the current organizational culture and know if your organizational culture will need to shift to support things like change management? When human error inevitably occurs, because there is a lot of discussion and discourse that smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0 will eliminate human error, that probably isn't true because our work is changing and the ways that humans will have to interact with one another, and the technology is also changing, as we'll see in our case studies. So how does the company, how does the organization handle error? Is it a way that is informative and educational, or is there a punitive culture that punishes people for making mistakes? There are things like job redesign, as I've touched upon in the earlier slide. So jobs are changing. What people's work goals, what's expected of them is changing. And because the technologies are increasing how we are connected and networked together, leadership is also shifting. So moving from a more hierarchical leadership structure to a more distributed one where there's shared decision-making, shared goal creation, and stakeholder engagement. And then we don't want to lose sight of the outcomes that we are focused on in a work environment. And these are examples, and the outcomes in your environment will definitely be different. They may be more refined than this, but I put up some large buckets to think about when you start to think about the work system and the processes that you're engaged in, and you're introducing new technologies. You're thinking about error rates, you're thinking about efficiency and productivity, but you're also thinking about the people, your workforce outcomes. Is there a high level of turnover? Are people stressed? Are they supported? How is this impacting the bottom line? So this is like our operating frame. This is like the hardware in our system. And we're going to think about ways that we're going to use this and categorize this into our work so that we can make decisions and understand and anticipate the problems, challenges, and opportunities that will arise. Oops, and I forgot one more thing. there's feedback loops. So as you move through the framework and you're moving into outcomes, you're using that as a mechanism to go back into the system and make adjustments. So it's not a linear framework. It is sort of a circular or circuitous framework where you're in the mix, in the realm of time is moving forward and things are changing, but you have a map, a set of metrics, and a set of feedback mechanisms to make changes as needed. So I'm just going to pause and see if there's any questions before we move into case studies. And there's also time at the end as well. So you can either drop into the chat, and I'm looking at the chat now, or you can come off mute. Great, so you may have a bit more, we're still in the framework realm, and I think you might have a bit more of your reflections to bring forward as we move into the case studies. So I'm going to move through 2 case studies, and as I move through the case studies, think about the work system, think about the people, think about the organization, think about what culture that person or that operator, these are going to be both smart manufacturing case studies. Think about the leadership environment that person might be operating in. Think about what sort of physical environment they'll be operating in or virtual. Think about tasks. So in both case studies, we're going to be talking about how operators, managers, and leadership, their tasks evolve. One case study will be a little bit more difficult, and the other will be sort of a counter to that, where things are going a little bit better. And then, of course, technology and tools are playing a role, and then they add some different ways to think about the change that is happening. So if you hear one, maybe you just have a piece of paper nearby, just jot it down, and we'll come back and have some group reflection once I move through the case studies. So the first case study is a smart manufacturing case study. And this is a company that got really excited about, and is still excited about, smart technologies and the promises that they hold. They hold a lot of promise for efficiency, reduction in error rates, reduction in downtime within the manufacturing plant. And this was a small medical device company, and they bought a very expensive robot. And they brought that robot into the production facility for all of these reasons that I just described. They bought the technology first. That was the first decision they made. And then once they had the technology, they asked their operators to volunteer to start to work with the robot on the assembly line. So in this manufacturing plant, they had very seasoned operators, like people that had 20 plus years, and they had less seasoned operators, people who had either just been hired or were in the first few years of working there. So when they asked for volunteers, the senior operators didn't come forward. So they had mostly inexperienced operators. This isn't a criticism of them being inexperienced. I'm just highlighting how the organization and the leadership and the way that they're helping to select the best candidates for the job isn't lying within the operators themselves. This is a selection process that occurs within an organization. So mostly inexperienced operators, people are a little bit younger in their career, people on the positive side, curious mindset, enthusiasm for the job. This is, some of the traits that can come along naturally with younger people who are starting out their career. They're curious, they see the technology as something that can help them in their career. The way they went about communication was a little bit scattershot. So, at a high level, they talked about how productivity was going to rise with the robot, and it wasn't going to replace the people on the line, which was true. They didn't replace people, people weren't laid off. But there wasn't really any explanation around how this new, very expensive, very sophisticated robot was going to produce those levels of productivity and not replace humans. They didn't really explain how jobs would change, if they would change at all, whose jobs would change, what it would mean for the next 5 years of planning. So people bought in the sense that they understand that technology can bring these benefits, but they didn't understand how, which led to a bit of mistrust. When the robot was implemented, there wasn't any training. So there was no manual to refer to. There wasn't, 3 days of training on learning how to resolve alarms, troubleshoot, operate. The vendor helped a bit, but it was more figure out as we go. We're going to start operating this robot and we'll see what happens. So you can imagine what this does to a person's stress level. The company really wanted to see that production goal be met immediately. They wanted to realize the promise of smart technologies soon. So in the sense of the learning and troubleshooting and getting staff and operators up to the level they need to do their job well, that takes time. And that means they may have to stop the line. It takes a timeline that wasn't realistic when they actually put it into implementation. There wasn't a change management process. So the robot didn't do it all for them. Their system was changing, their operational environment was changing. This requires a change management process that really thinks through what are the new tasks that we're going to ask our operators to engage in? What do their new jobs look like? What's the level of complexity that they'll have to move from perhaps a more repetitive job to a more cognitively engaged job where they're trying to understand alarms and troubleshoot and survey the situation as it relates to the robot's performance. Perhaps most troublesome within this company was that there wasn't an overall culture that supported honest and open problem identification and how you talk about problems and how you report issues. You can make a parallel to occupational safety and health. Companies that really embrace occupational safety and health and the health of their workers talk about safety problems a lot. They want to know what's going to endanger our staff so that they can get ahead of any problems that might hurt anyone. So there's an analogous form out there in organizations where we can look to occupational and safety and health and see what they're doing and see how they got there to sort of remediate cultures that don't support problem identification. So the operators' stress is mounting. They don't have training. There's an unrealistic timeline. They have to figure out how to troubleshoot with this robot in a new way. And there isn't a culture and a mechanism for them to talk about what they don't know, the problems they're seeing, and the errors that might be occurring. So this does affect the bottom line. Yes, there's efficiencies to be had. Productivity levels can definitely be increased. But what this company saw over time in the medium and long term is that their workforce started to turn over. Operators started to quit. People retired a bit early. Even middle management started to turn over. So what does this mean? There's a loss of experienced operators. These are people who really know a lot about the line. There's also a loss of production time because when people leave, you have to bring on new people and train them and bring them up to level. So just take a moment And if you haven't jotted down any things that stood out to you in the work system, take a moment and just jot them quickly down on a piece of paper, and we'll come back to it. So let's move to the second case study. And this isn't a perfect company by any stretch. There's no such thing as perfect. There's no such thing as a totally optimized company. But this is a company that is doing things a little bit more different. So this is a space aeronautical company, and they are continuously bringing new technologies to their operational line. So this isn't something that is brand new. It may not be something that happens every day or even every quarter, but it's happening yearly at least, where there is a new smart technology that they're bringing to the line and they have to adapt and change to it. So when a smart technology change occurs in this organization, they anticipate the training that's required at multiple levels. So the operators need a training. Their supervisors need to understand what's different around the process, what's different around the tasks of the operator, what's different around the managers or management level as they are tracking the more strategic objectives of the operational lines. So they think through these layers and they bring training along with the technology every time something new is introduced. They think about job design. So an operator's job may not be completely overhauled when a new technology is introduced. It depends on the technology, depends on what they're doing, but something will need to change. And the thing that I would like you all to remember when we talk about the how, I see your question and I will come back to it as soon as I get through this case study. What I want you to think about when we're bringing in smart technologies and bringing in Industry 4.0 technologies that will remove repetitive tasks, tasks away from the human. It doesn't mean that they're going to still do nothing. In fact, their task complexity, their cognitive complexity will likely increase because they'll have to move to more analytical problem solving and troubleshooting. So in a lot of ways, their jobs are in a sense getting enriched in the sense that they have to bring more cognitive complexity to their work. And the less repetitive, less rote things will likely disappear. In this company, there's time constraints to consider. So although they are really thinking through training and documentation, it's a little bit on the fly. Like they haven't yet built in time to create training and document process changes into people's work, mainly the engineers and the managers. So another point to consider is because training is so critical to the implementation of these technologies, creating time for engineers, particularly the managing engineers, to document the changes and the trainings is really important. There is a little bit of legacy thinking in management, and I didn't put the word legacy thinking in the first case study, but it was definitely permeating in that culture where they were in the old way and they were starting to bring in these new technologies with the robot. This is not so much the case. They are a relatively younger company, so there's some legacy thinking about what we did 10 years ago, but because they're more on the innovative side as a culture, it ultimately isn't a barrier, but it's something that they have to navigate when they're bringing changes forward. So what really stood out in this company is that when they were bringing in a new smart technology, they were really savvy about the way they communicated things. They communicated that that they were making a change. They had thought through operations, they thought through the benefits of the technology, and we are making a change. And this is how they describe it to the operators. So first they describe what's currently happening in the operational line. And then they describe the change. What will this new status look like? What will this new technology look like? What will the new operations look like? What will your job look like? And then quantify. And this company found that it was very helpful to quantify it with a bit of data about why is this change better? What benefits is the company, the operator, the production line, whatever those outcomes are, quantify how it will be better. So this is all happening in communication. This is usually happening in a conversation. It can be, broadcast through email or communication channels. But when you're working with operators who are going to be absorbing the change, I personally really recommend at least one conversation, one-on-one or in a group. And this is how this company approached it. And then you ask for, well, what do you think about that? What is your input on this? And taking a moment to answer questions, anticipate challenges. Many times the operators have a lot of knowledge around all the issues that occur day to day on the manufacturing floor. So this is a moment that they gather input, they gather their thinking, and this is really helping the buy-in. It's helping them to understand what's happening, why it's better. They feel like a participant in the conversation and in the change rather than the change happening to them. So a pithy way that they described it is just don't have an ego about it. Go in, talk really clearly, ask for input, ask for a conversation. And in this environment, it tends to go well, the changes. Again, not perfect. There's some legacy thinking, but it tends to go well. So 2 cases in smart manufacturing, some differences, some similarities. And I'd be curious to hear from the group, what are the main differences that you saw between the first medical device company and the space aeronautical company? What really stood out to you as how they approached things differently? Feel free to drop it into the chat or come off mute. How? Communication and transparency, absolutely. That's really striking in the second case study, where the culture is a bit more open and a little bit more wanting to engage and understand that we are in a continuous change process. Amy, the second case study is more human-centered. Amy, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thinking. How so? Feel free to come off mute or drop a few more sentences in the chat. How is it more human-centered? I think it really stands out with Pau's earlier statement around communication and transparency, because they're really thinking through what are the changes and communicating those changes at the different levels really succinctly. So Amy says, I thought the second one involved more of the workers together and informed the workers about the change. So absolutely. One of the trade-offs is it is more time intensive to do this change management, culture building process, but we can also look to that investment yielding benefits down the line because that company didn't see a lot of worker turnover. So we have short and long-term goals in mind when we have a more human-centered approach to the technologies and change. And I kind of answered partially the second question about why companies might be better positioned to be successful in smart manufacturing. And when you intentionally prioritize people instead of the self-centered goals of the mind, yeah, that is really true, Pal. This can really have a lot of impact on the organization's culture and the bottom line. And John writes around case study number 1 that there was no feedback loop for operators before implementation, so there was no buy-in. There was no why behind the what for the implementation and no definition of what success looks like. Yes, that's a great point. All of that is absolutely true. And a lot of that can get addressed in planning and thinking through impact and thinking through the impacts it will have on the technological side of the organization, but also the people, the strategy, the tasks, the workload. Great discussion. I'll just give one more. Oh, so which company do you think is better positioned to be successful? I mean, it's a little bit obvious since we've been talking. One of the things that I hear a lot in this realm is how fast things are moving, how fast and how efficient technologies can make our bottom lines, our productivity, but it does have other consequences. It has other impacts that affects people, affects their well-being, it affects their stress, it affects their health, and it affects businesses' bottom lines as we talk about workforce, recruitment, retention, investment in professional development and training. All of that matters when it comes to really taking the promise of Industry 4.0 and having us, the humans, being really mindful around these technologies and having the humans be in charge of how they're implemented, operated, and managed. So we can't run from it. This is happening. So the way that we show up in our work and the way that we understand how these systems work can have a profound effect on the well-being of people and our success in business. So I've come up with at least, there's more, but I wanted to give you some high-level ways to think about integration for holistic digital transformation. So what can you do? Be realistic about timelines. So a lot of time goes into planning, communication. I would recommend a pilot phase. If you buy an expensive technology and you're new to this realm, you're piloting it with well-trained people. You're giving people space to experiment and understand what's happening in the implementation phase and ramp up to a more super efficient, highly productive operational line. You might perform some readiness assessments within your organization and see where you are in those 5 buckets around the holistic work system. Where is your culture at? What is leadership like? How honestly are we talking about issues? How is training currently documented and delivered? How are people's jobs and tasks going to change in their work? So that task analysis is really important, and that's one of the reasons why I drew that out of the readiness assessment, that it's not just the technology that's changing, people's work is changing. It's likely going to bring more complexity into their jobs, more cognitive complexity, and more task complexity. Engage stakeholders in the change. So at different levels throughout the process, in the planning, in the designing, in the implementation, you want to be asking for their thinking, going through those steps like the Space Aeronautical Company did in their change management process, and look for ways to show people data, be really transparent, show why the change is beneficial. And if there's issues, bring that forward too. It'll help to foster that more safety-oriented culture. And the investment in training and development can't be underscored. I've heard this in multiple firms, that when there's problems, it's usually the investment in training people differently and in supporting their new work hasn't been made. So we really need to think through those budget lines and those strategic priorities, that people will feel supported, trained well, have things documented so that they can navigate these new spaces. So that is the 5 ways, and I see some questions coming in, and I'd love to dive in. So earlier, how do you encourage change management, leadership, administration to change their perfection and rigid definition of success? To not rely on band-aids. How can you tell if a company is ready to change in their stress anxiety culture and take ownership in recognizing unrealistic or inefficient and toxic expectations? So it depends on where you are at that level in the company. Ultimately, people do look to leadership to understand the vision and to set the tone for the culture. And that's not to say that culture isn't influenced by all levels of the organization, but ultimately, strategic leadership needs to understand particularly these 5 things that I brought forward around what's important around technology. So it comes to mindset. It comes from a mindset of being realistic about what technology can and can't do. And it takes some perhaps education on leadership's part to understand what culture is. And it does take, if you're operating in a quote unquote toxic culture, a culture that doesn't support honest conversations, it does really require a lot of courage on the part of leadership to start to open their minds and open their ears to hear what's really happening. So there's a bit of self-reflection that has to occur if they're not already in this space where it's like, oh, I see these 5 things that Sarah just said, and we're ready. Like, our attitudes and our strategic priorities, we can be flexible to start to move in this direction. We might need more understanding, more working with someone around, well, where are we on readiness? Get some feedback from your kitchen cabinet, from an outside source. So around their question around stress and anxiety, this is one of the reasons I really take the time to explain the person at the center of the holistic digital transformation. All of those components, humans are not robots. We experience stress and burnout. Our health is compromised when we experience those things. So that's from a personal well-being perspective. From a business perspective, productivity decreases. So I'm trying to hold both, because people need to understand their business bottom lines, but we also need to take care of one another. Both are true. So when we think about technology, we have to think about how it affects the person in the system. We don't want stress. Stress will lead to human errors in the production line, and we certainly don't want anyone to be harmed. So we have to start to bring this forward into our designs as we think about and design for bringing in a new technology, bringing in a new change, and bringing that component into the thinking. And then another question, how do companies navigate conversations that are uncomfortable? That is the $1 million question, isn't it? It's partially answered, and I would love to hear what other people think and what you've experienced. This is just my perch from being an advisor and what I see across organizations, but certainly it's not the only view. So if there's other leaders in this group, please feel free to come off mute or put things into the chat. Yeah, it can begin with therapy. Absolutely. Therapists are a wonderful resource to help to build the individual capacity to being uncomfortable. So when we have more personal capacity to feel uncomfortable and to have difficult conversations, we can have the difficult conversations and we're not avoiding it anymore. because it's in that avoidance that we start to see the problems emerge, where people don't feel safe enough to bring forward, hey, I made a mistake with your new $3 million robot. I can't figure out this alarm code. And it could honestly be something that could be easily remediated, but cause the person tremendous stress because they don't feel safe enough to bring it forward. So leadership, management, building that trust within themselves and each other to hear things that they may not want to hear is a skill. And it takes practice, and it takes a culture that supports it. It comes from the tone from the top. It comes with skill. So communication is absolutely a skill. And there's tons of resources out there on how to have and how to navigate difficult conversations. I'm not an expert in it, but there's plenty out there. So it's like looking at problems as an opportunity to improve rather than to hide or to downplay what's wrong. I love those questions because it's really, really true. And we still have about 8 more minutes. So there's what resources do I recommend? So the field of education, I feel, has such wonderful resources on skill building around communication, and courageous conversations is one that's coming to mind right now around how to have difficult conversations and the skills needed to do that. And what I can do is bring some links and bring a couple of resources and email the participants in the group after the session closes. So I'll follow up that with an email. Great question. You're welcome. Anyone else? And it doesn't have to be a question. You could just share your experience. John, trust is indeed cultural. He recommends Patrick Clistone's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and his At the Table podcast. Great, thank you, John. I will put that into the email for everyone. And if you'd like to describe a little bit more about how you've used it, you're welcome to come off mute.
Yeah, this is John. We've just in First Thing Interactive, it's the 5 dysfunctions of the team is staple to this culture, and that trust has to start. It's a long haul, but that building that trust for somebody to point something out, a mistake, or feel confident that they're going to point something out and not get fired is deeply cultural. But Patrick Ciccione handles that in 5 dysfunctions of a team, and then they have various podcast episodes around that same concept at the table. Very powerful concepts shared in the book and the podcast.
Great, thank you, John.
I've got one, Sarah. This is Renee. You mentioned access and growing wealth disparities using just in terms of the modernization and Industry 4.0. And as you're seeing this growth in wealth disparities and looking at these tips, they're really organization by organization. So kind of a micro level, kind of scaling up to that macro. How are you seeing this thinking disrupt that divide that's occurring, and what else can be done as we're thinking about those shifts in the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really I crafted this session for you all who are more on the practitioner side. We need engagement in government within countries. We need a common language around what these technologies are and how they work. And there needs to be a redistribution of wealth, which is far beyond the scope of what I can bring forward as an advisor, and my guess likely you all in your various realms of work in companies and education organizations. But it takes all of us understanding one by one the impacts and the realities of how this widens the gap to be able to change it. So the changes that I'm bringing forward in my, hopefully the value I'm bringing forward are in, it's happening job by job. It's happening work culture by work culture. It's each human in the system understanding what the impacts are. But on a macro, Renee, your question is really astute. We need these larger organizations and the ways that wealth is distributed to be probably, I mean, it's probably going to take legislation. We don't have any. It's really the Wild West. So I'm not a macroeconomist, so I don't really have a technical answer, but I see this disparity and where I want to add that value, where I want perhaps each of you to start to consider in your own minds is to bring forward, there's actual people who are impacted by this, and we need to think through how they're impacted. And each time we think through that, and each time we move through a cycle of organizational redesign, we all become a little bit smarter about how this works. And then when we go to interact with the larger system around government, economy, your next realm of voting next year, you have a better understanding about what the realities are and the impacts that a new technology can have. Hopefully that answers a little bit of your question. It's a big, beautiful question, Renee. Maybe you have thoughts.
I have a lot of thoughts, but not for 2 minutes. I just think that, the implications of larger systemic needs. So I work at United Way. So in terms of social service networks, the demand is larger. And I think in terms of pathways toward wealth building and self-sufficiency, we just have to do it in a different and better way. So I think the new economy creates new opportunities. And so thanks for making us smarter about thinking about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you. Anyone else? I have uploaded the slide deck to the Forward Fest platform. I did it this afternoon. And if you have a couple minutes, it won't even take a couple minutes, but I do have a really quick feedback survey. It's just to help me improve the sessions I bring forward and what you might be interested in. It shouldn't take more than 1 or 2 minutes. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I have this recorded. We'll put it up on the site, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day and a wonderful festival. Have a great afternoon.